Good evening, everyone. Good evening. We live in very, very strange times. We live in times that are changing more today than perhaps any other time in history. In fact, there has only been one other time in history when conspiracies and groups of individuals and groups to bring about revolution, change, and to affect the very future of mankind. When did that take place? It took place in the 18th century, the century of revolution. Today, we live in a century of revolution. That revolution spirit, the revolution phenomenon, is before our very eyes. It is being controlled by groups of individuals, groups of people who have a very wicked purpose in their heart, and they wish to control and manipulate the whole of mankind, and indeed bring mankind to its destruction. We are going to look at a time in our past when the influences that we see today worked their magic, but a group of people in this land overcame them and stopped the very essence of worldwide revolution in its tracks. We're going to have two readings this evening. Our first reading is taken from the book of Ezekiel, and we're reading in chapter 22. We'll read from verse 25 down to verse 28. There is a conspiracy of her prophets in the midst thereof, like a roaring lion, ravening the prey. They have devoured souls. They have taken the treasure and precious things. They have made her many widows in the midst thereof. Her priests have violated my law, and have profaned my holy things. They have put no difference between the holy and profane. Neither have they showed difference between the unclean and the clean. And they have hid their eyes from my Sabbaths, and I am profane among them. Her princes in the midst thereof are like wolves ravening the prey, to shed blood and to destroy souls, to get dishonest gain. And her prophets have daubed them with untempered mortar, saying vanity, and divining lies unto them, saying, Thus saith the Lord God, when the Lord God hath not spoken. Our second reading this evening is taken from Jeremiah chapter 11, and we'll be reading verse 9. And the Lord said unto me, A conspiracy is found among the men of Judah, and among the inhabitants of Jerusalem. They are turned back to the iniquities of their forefathers, which refused to hear my words. And they went after other gods to serve them. The house of Israel and the house of Judah have broken my covenants, which I made with their fathers. Our motto text this evening is taken from Daniel chapter 12, verse 10. The wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. We're going to not really have a sermon tonight, because the contents that we're going to look at isn't really for a sermon. This is more of a lecture about the content and the historical content of what these people who believe in conspiracies and these people who are involved in conspiracies tried to do in the 17th century. And by looking at that, and by understanding the manoeuvres and their manipulations, how we can see what they're doing today. The great Protestant patriot, revivalist and Orangeman Hugh Hanna once said, In controversy our faith was born, and in controversy it will be maintained. He could have also made this comment about the order to which he belonged. Since its conception, the Orange institution and its predecessors have been lambasted and blackened by both papist propagandists and adherents to the New World Order in its various forms. Add to this those who hid behind false spirituality and attack Orangism as being anti-biblical, and we can see that its detractors are many. Why is Orangism hated and held with such contempt by these various groups and individuals? Can the accusations being hurled by these various groups of papists, liberal evangelicals and Jesuit-inspired one-worlders be true? This is what we are going to look at tonight. We're going to look at the background of the formation of the Orange Order. We're going to look at the background of the formation of groups that existed at the time of the formation of the Orange Order, and why that is significant, and why it is significant to us today. After the Glorious Revolution, a number of small groups, both noble and common, continued to celebrate its success by coming together on the 1st of July every year, the anniversary of William's greatest victory at the Battle of the Boyne. This occurred throughout the whole of Great Britain and Ireland. In Bandon, County Cork, we had a sham fight every July. These groups were often small and localised, with local names like the Bandon Williamites, the Wicklow Orange Blazers and the Wexford True Blues. As the 18th century rolled on, various groups emerged in Ireland with the intent of overthrowing the liberty that the Protestant Revolution had won. These became known collectively as the White Boys. Due to the seditious nature of Romanism, restrictive laws had to be put on Romanism to stop its political machinations. Small skirmishes and attacks continued throughout the early and mid-18th century. Things in Europe took a turn, and they say, in a colloquialism, poured petrol on the fire that what was taking place in Ireland. The 1770s saw a number of significant events that were to set the stage, as it were, for the dawning of Orangism. 1770 saw a general history of the Christian Church being published. Now, this is a very significant event. It was published by a man called Senior Pastone, which is the nom de plume of the Roman Catholic bishop called Charles Wellesley. And what he gave was a history of the Catholic Church put into being through the book of Revelation. So here we have the first teaching of the Catholic Church in the book of Revelation. What is so significant about that? The significance was that he said that the teaching in the book of Revelation showed that Protestantism throughout the world would be destroyed within 50 years. So he published his book about the history of the Catholic Church, and it said, within 50 years, don't worry about this heresy which is called Protestantism. It's going to be wiped out. It's going to be destroyed. God is going to judge it. This publication became, as you can imagine, an overnight success in Ireland. It was actually stated at the time that every inn had a copy of it, and every home had a small booklet of it. And of course, for those who couldn't read and were illiterate, we had public readings. So you can picture the stage is set where you have mass gatherings of papists coming along, and their priest is preaching to them out of the book of Revelation, and he's telling God's calling time on this Protestant heresy. Judgment's coming, it's going to be destroyed, and we are going to see it in our lifetime. They were fired up beyond belief They couldn't believe what they were hearing. These people had experienced defeat. But yet of all here, people were telling them out of the Word of God that God was going to judge the Protestant Reformation and overturn the Protestant Revolution, and Ireland and the world again would be Catholic. Bernal, in his memoirs of Jacobitism in Ireland, tells us that in areas which had a high papist population, handbills were distributed continually with these aims. And also, at the same meeting, they distributed handbills claiming to come from a group called Orangemen, before the Orange Order had existed, claiming what they would do to Roman Catholics and Papists. Significantly, at the same time as this was taking place in the Roman Catholic community, or Papist community, whatever term you want to use, the New Light movement was taking hold. The New Light movement, as it is known, began its life in the universities of Scotland. Ideas that were imported from Central Europe flourished in these fountains of error. What was happening was Scotland had a very close relationship with France. The continent was, a lot of heresy was taking place in the continent. For instance, there were teachings from Michael Servetus, or Cervantes, whatever way you want to pronounce it. He was the actual man who was actually burned at the stake of Geneva. He brought forward Arian ideas that Christ wasn't the Son of God. He was just a man, a vile man. His blood did not cleanse you from any sin. And this man wrote books. And it's very significant that there are only 4 copies of his book in existence today. Do you know where one of them was found? One of them was found in Edinburgh University. So these teachings were coming across through the old routes into Scotland and into the universities there, and they were taking hold. And they were called New Lighters because they brought new light on God's holy word. But it wasn't new light, it was old error. What really happened then was that Presbyterians from Ireland had no universities. So if you were a Presbyterian, or you were landed and you had money and you wanted to educate your son, or you wanted him to become a doctor, or you wanted him to become a minister, he couldn't go to Trinity College. He had to go to Glasgow University, or he had to go to Edinburgh University. While he was there, men like Francis Hutcheson taught him Arianism. And that's how New Light Presbyterianism, later to be called Unitarianism, started to engulf the Presbyterian Church in Ulster. These heresies began to infest Ulster's pulpits, especially in areas like County Down and Antrim. In 1776, the American War of Independence began. A lot of Ulster Presbyterians looked upon this with very favourably. In fact, the first victory of the War of Independence took place where? Belfast Lough. Believe it or not, Belfast Lough was the first victory of the American War of Independence because the American Navy sunk a British warship beside Carrickfergus Castle. And there were a lot of people who supported that war. But as time went on, Presbyterians seen more and more people dying. Then the French got involved in the war. It waned. Presbyterians came back, and their support for that war waned. In 1778, the French captured and held Carrickfergus for almost a week. This scared, literally scared, the people and the Protestants of the United Kingdom, especially those in Ulster. They seen this. They can take here. They can hold our land. They can take it from us. As a result of that, the volunteer movement was born. The volunteer movement was a group of initially Presbyterians, Anglicans, that were brought together as sort of militias. They learned how to drill, they bought their own weaponry, and their whole raison d'etre was to defend Ireland against the invasion of the French. That's what they did. That's what they believed in. That's what they held dear. They were there as a specific group to make a bulwark against the French invading Ireland. Then came the French Revolution, which split the volunteer movement in two. Some of the volunteers started marching, instead of marching on the 1st of July, they started marching on the 14th of July in remembrance of the storming of the Bastille. And as time went on, revolutionary French ideas started to permeate into Presbyterian thinking and into some Anglican thinking. Agent provocateurs like the prominent Mason Hamilton Rowan, a member of the Grand Orient in France, who was a friend of Adam Weishaupt, the founder of the Illuminati, made his way to Ireland. Rowan owned Killaloe Castle, but had never set foot in the country until the 1790s. He had toured Europe and America spreading Illuminati teachings. Then came the Reverend William Jackson, a Newton Ardsman who was a French agent. The plan was to put a Masonic utopia in place. This is strange whenever we look at modern day Ulster, because some people have the concept and the thinking that Freemasonry and the Orange institution are some way connected. That's what we're going to look at, and you're going to see that that is not the case. Amen. Very, very wrong perception of history if you think that Freemasonry and Orangism are connected in any way. While these events were taking place, the persecution of rural Protestants continued. Papists fired up with talk and invasion and prophecies of doom began to arm themselves. Some of the Illuminati-inspired volunteer companies passed on arms and ammunition, and even threatened to take up arms in defence of them. And one of those groups was actually very significant, was the Loch Gaul Volunteers. Here we had a group of what were called volunteers that were meant to stop, defend Ireland for Protestantism, stop invasion from France, and they had been turned that much that they were planning to defend and take up guns to defend Catholicism. Isn't that very significant from the way we look at things today? Here we have groups across this country today that were formed, their whole raison d'etre was formed to defend Protestantism, but yet of all they're running over the border. They're threatening people who would preach Protestantism, and they have twisted the whole concept of loyalty and Protestantism on its head. That took place in the 1790s, as it's taking place today. This caused the volunteers who had not disbanded to be suppressed in 1793. So here we see the volunteer movement, as it had been set forward to defend Protestantism, had twisted that much. It had split. Some had went one way, some had went the other way. The government actually had to suppress it and disband it because it had become that corrupt. The People Day Boys, another group, were said to have been formed in 1784 at Mount Norris after a local clash at a fair. Guns had been given to the local papists by the local New Lighters sympathetic to them. Presbyterian ministers in Market Hill, Tantagee and Drumbannocker, these are all surrounding little villages, if you know the area, around that area, were all infiltrated by New Light Presbyterians. Over the next few years, Protestants formed together to raid homes and search for illegal weaponry. So what really happened is Papists had started to arm themselves. In fact, some local gentry who lived in the area had actually started giving guns to Papists to buy off their support because they thought a revolution was on its way. The volunteers had started to slip guns their way too, and they had started to actually raid Protestant homes for guns. So what we seen was a group of people coming together that was called the People Day Boys, or the Break of Day Boys, and they got that name because they would go in to Catholic homes in the early hours of the morning, just at daybreak, and they would search them for illegal weaponry, because what you have to remember is you could not own a firearm and be a papist. But there had been significant importation of arms to papists for resurrection. These people went looking the guns. You'll hear today that they were terrible people. They weren't. They were doing what the government should have been doing. In November 1786, a large group of defenders attacked Protestant homes in Tandragee. It was suppressed by the volunteers who disarmed them. The Reverend William Campbell wrote to a friend informing him that he and the other Protestant ministers of the surrounding areas had tried to calm down tensions. But he wrote in his letter that while they had did this, Papist priests had done much more mischief by writing pamphlets and inflammatory leaflets and giving them out to those who were attacking Protestant homes. In late November 1788, a company of volunteers were marching from Benburb. They had marched to church on a Sunday. They would dress up in their uniforms. They wouldn't arm themselves, but they would dress up in their uniforms and march back and forward to church. And as they marched from Benburb to Armagh Cathedral, a couple of hundred papists gathered because they wanted to disarm these volunteers. Unknown to them, they didn't arm themselves going to church on a Sunday. They were attacked, and some of their uniforms were taken, bayonets were taken, but they got away. And while they were on their way home, they had stopped and they had received help from other volunteers in the area, and they actually armed themselves. On their way back, they were attacked again and had to open fire. This caused a lot of consternation in the area and an upraise of tension. And this continued on. There was a continual jostling and attacking and hounding of Protestants, especially in this county, Armagh, Tyrone, some parts of Down area. Antrim, Belfast, Down, East Down, okay. There weren't that many. These areas were severely and secured for Protestants because they had nothing to fear. But anywhere where there was a significant majority of Roman Catholics, Protestants were being hounded. This led in 1791 to what was one of the most ghastly crimes of its time. It's become known as the Fork Hill outrage. Richard Jackson had left a will, and he had left a large amount of money to actually build schools around that area. He owned land, and as he had died, he didn't have family, so he wanted to look after the children of the area, and he left a will to bequeath money to build schools and to build one church. On the 20th of January, around 50 defenders first and opened fire the Reverend Edward Hudson, killing his horse, and then they burned his house. Next, they moved on to the schoolmaster Alexander Barclay's home. Once there, his wife was beaten and raped by the defenders. She then died later as a result of one of her breasts being cut off. He had his tongue cut out, and his nephew was also brutalised and died later as a result of the attack. These are things that people don't want you to hear about, what was taking place. They want to tell you about the terrible People Day Boys, the terrible Orangemen, what they were doing to the poor innocent Catholic. They will not put into perspective what was taking place in these areas to bring about that. In the late summer of 1794, the defenders raised a large contingent of men and set about driving out the Scotchmen, as they called them, out of County Cavan. Open battle ensued, with the defenders attacking Protestant homes and taking the village of Balna. Protestants armed and moved against the defenders, retaking the village. The defenders lost over 100 men in the ensuing retaking. Freemasons and New Light Presbyterians, influenced by the Illuminati's French republicanism, began to agitate for parliamentary reform. They used their sway within the volunteer movement to turn it from a patriotic defence league opposed to French ideology and imperialism into a group mainly in East Ulster, espousing French revolutionary philosophy. Volunteer groups began to admit Roman Catholics and in some cases arm them. As we had said earlier, the Loughgall volunteers openly invited Roman Catholics to join their ranks and come along and learn how to shoot. This was accompanied by sectarian attacks on isolated Protestants by the Papists and New Light agitation from the pulpits. Freemasons and volunteers openly marched to the opening of Belfast's first chapel, and men like the Reverend Thomas Birch openly called for revolution in his sermons. By 1790, the Masons and Papist defenders had forged close ties. There were reports of men like Lord Gosford had begun to arm local Papists. This, of course, being illegal. He used the excuse that his orchards needed to be protected from poaching and pilfering. Because of the numbers of Catholics in Armagh, they appeared more threatening to their Protestant neighbours than in other counties, such as Antrim or Down. Contrary to what some would have you believe, the origins of Orangism were not just the proviso of Anglicans. Today, Presbyterians would have you believe that it was only Anglicans actually joined the Orange Order. The majority of people who were involved with the early Orange Order before it was taken over by the Anglican establishment in the 1820s were common Presbyterians, ordinary men. They weren't ministers, one or two ministers maybe joined, but they were just ordinary Presbyterians. Large numbers of Presbyterians formed themselves into Orange groups with lower class Anglicans. They were known as William's men, Orange clubs or Orangemen. Ordinary people's homes were adorned in July and December with pictures of William crossing the Boyne and makeshift decorations. Orange garlands and ribbons festooned numerous country cottages. These public expressions were not always supported by the gentry. In fact, the bonding together of Protestants of all denominations brought concern from those who owned large swathes of land. From the mid-1780s, a campaign to eradicate Protestantism from the rural areas of Ulster began with vigour. Homesteads would be attacked, livestock killed, churches burned, and in some cases ministers murdered. While new leaders were preaching of the brotherhood of man and an ecumenist gospel, the Reverend Macomb's meeting house across Maclean was burned and local Protestants were abused. Local farm servants who joined the defenders were told that the fields would soon flow red with Protestant blood. Freud said houses were burnt, cattle were festooned with the particular ferocity which characterises the Irish peasants. The udders of cows belonging to Protestants were sliced off. Arms were demanded, and if not delivered, death was the punishment. From 1791, a new group calling itself the Defenders, a use of the older name, began to engage in violent acts against Protestants. An account of the late insurrection in Ireland states that they were very different from those who originally took the name, and that all were Catholics. They were in general poor, ignorant and labouring men, sworn to secrecy. And it goes on to tell us that this group's activities were focused mainly in Meath, Cavan, Monaghan, Armagh and the Tyrone areas. Its initial aim was to ransack homes and farms to get arms. The report then goes on to say, but soon proceeded to plundering them of whatever they could find. So whenever they didn't get a gun, they just robbed you blind. The report then tells us that because of the secrecy and regularity of their attacks, it was believed that men of superior rank were helping them. There were also collections made throughout Ireland to help their cause. After each Mass, men would gather and take up a collection for arms to arm the defenders. Tensions had been on the rise due to this continual violence and the build-up of tensions. Something changed in 1791. In 1791, a circular from what was called the Dublin Society started to circulate around the whole island of Ireland. Specifically, A lot of them were circulated in Dublin and in the border counties and in Belfast. The Dublin Society, believe it or not, is another name for what is called the Irish Brotherhood, which in turn, believe it or not, was the Society of United Irishmen. It called for recruitment of men. Look around, it said, for men who were fit to form the stable supports on which Ireland may rest the levers of its liberty. And went on to tell us that if you can get 10, take them. If you can get 2, take 2, because all the numbers will add up that they would eventually take the country. The government of the time seemed unwilling or unable to take action against these growing groups. In fact, the only thing that it did was put a report out. And the report said, as a result of our inquiries, it is our opinion it is inconsistent with public safety and tranquility to permit men of arms to assemble when they please without legal authority. So there you go. Burning of Protestants, wrecking of their homes, burning of their churches, killing of their people. It was just inconsistent with public safety to allow these people to gather. On the 12th of July 1791, a group of a few hundred Protestants came together to hold what they called a Remembrance Day at Alcaderg in County Down. They marched to the sound of flute and drum coming to the old ferry fort at Lisnagard. They were attacked by a large number of papists from the tree-covered ferry hill, who had come as far away as Drogheda. Firing into the marchers as they descended, the papists scattered the Protestants that were gathered and hoisted the flag of the Stuart kings on a banner of the Virgin Mary. The Orangemen rallied once they seen this, and as one writer put it, in commando style, took the hill again, forcing the papists into an open field, and in torrent after torrent of musket fire, the papists fled in the direction of Loch Bricklin. So we see that there's a continual flux of violence being directed against Protestants in these areas, why they're two-pronged attack, why that's taking place. There is a continual attack on the belief system of Protestantism, the watering down of Protestantism, and is that not what we're seeing today? Exactly what we see today. Of course, there were occultic influences in these groups. The new leaders formed themselves into groups of Masons with the aim of overthrowing the government and biblical truth. They had handshakes and signs and would ask one another, "Are you consecrated?" And the answer would be yes. And for what reason are you consecrated? And they would tell, to dethrone the kings, all the kings in our Irish land. The birth of Irish republicanism came directly from the one world Bavarian Illuminati spread through Freemasonry. Not only were the United Irishmen mostly Masons, but they had their own occultic practices. It was required of every one of them, and this report says that every member wore day and night an amulet around his neck containing the great principles by which unites the brotherhood in gold letters. So this was a magical amulet, magical symbol that these people had to wear next to their body day and night to influence them. So we see that there was a revolutionary fervour going on here. It was spreading. It had been in France. It was in America. It was in England. There was a group called the North Britain Society. And it was in Ireland. See, these people had a plan. They got America first. Then they got France. Then they needed the stepping stone. Ireland to take Britain. They had a plan. Billinger, writing in The Fire in the Minds of Men, conveys a number of very important facts about the origin of what he calls the revolutionary faith that was spreading throughout France, spreading throughout Ireland, and spreading throughout America. The revolutionary faith was, he says, was shaped not so much as by critical rationalism of the French Revolution, as is generally believed, but by the proto-romanticism of Germany. He then goes on to tell us what he means by that. The flame of faith had begun its migration a century earlier, when some European aristocrats had transferred their lighted candles from Christian altars to Masonic lodges. Further, he states, the flame of occult alchemy, which had promised to turn dross into gold, reappeared, seeking to recreate a golden age. And he then tells us, he's telling us where their faith come from. Their faith wasn't in the Bible. Their faith wasn't in the Lord Jesus Christ. Their faith was a strange faith. It was a strange fire. Where did it come from? It came from the Bavarian Illuminati. And then he tells us what way it was conveyed to these revolutionary groups. Why Freemasonry is talking about these revolutionary groups, the revolution in America, the revolutionary groups in Ireland and in France, while Freemasonry gave it vocabulary, it was the Illuminism that provided the structural model. Organisational plan was simply lifted from the Bavarian order of the Illuminists. So everything that you have been taught about the United Irishmen coming together as one little group of Irishmen with no influences, just sorry about poor wee Roman Catholics being badly treated, is a load of rubbish. These people were influenced by European thinking. These people were brought together by European occultism. And these people had a plan of world domination. So what was the teachings of the Illuminati? What were they saying? What had their idea? What was their idea for mankind? The corruption of the clergy by ourselves, the corruption which ought one day to enable us to put the church in our tomb. That's what their teaching was. They corrupted the clergy. Next, the clergy corrupted the people. And soon after that, there was no church. Because they taught you that the Bible was nonsense. It was a fable. It meant nothing. That Christ's blood was no better than dishwater, some of these people say. That's the vileness of their teaching. And how were they to do this? They were to spread these ideas, these fallacies through Freemasonry. The Duke of Brunswick in 1794 warned us, a great sect arose which, taking for its motto the good and happiness of man, worked in the darkness of conspiracy to make the happiness of humanity a prey for itself. This sect is known to everyone. Its brothers are known no less than its name. That was wide known. Everybody knew this in this day. The plan they had formed for breaking all social ties and the destroying of all order was revealed in their speeches and acts. Indomitable price, thirst of power were such the only motives of this sect. Their masters had nothing less in view than the thrones of the earth, and the government of the nations was to be directed by their nocturnal clubs. So that was their view. Control, manipulation, take over all. That's alright. That's supposition. I've given you a bit of supposition there. You could well say to me, that's alright. Their ideas of the Freemasons, the United Irishmen, all might be similar. Where's the connection, Clifford? Where's the hardcore evidence? That's what you want to know, isn't it? Well, there were a few leaders of the United Irishmen who were in the Illuminati. Rowan Hamilton, specifically one. And then we have one of the leaders was a man called Lord Fitzgerald. Lord Fitzgerald was found and had to hide in France for 2 years because he was found in possession of seditious material. Do you know where he went to live in France. He went to live in France with none other than Thomas Paine. Now, maybe I'm taking things for granted here that you know who Thomas Paine was. He was the author of The Rights of Man, the very man who brought illuminist thinking and revolutionary thinking to the whole world. So Lord Fitzgerald went and he lived in Paine's house. Paine lived in a ménage à trois with Nicholas Bonneville and his wife. Very polite way of saying he lived in a threesome there. So we have Lord Fitzgerald living with these people in this. Who is Nicholas Bonneville? Well, the fair and hearts of men tell us who Nicholas Bonneville was. Nicholas Bonneville was the decisive channel of Illuminist influence. He was converted to Illuminist ideas during the first two visits to Paris in June 1787 by Weishaupt's leading associate Christian Bode. Another connection with the United Irishmen was Hamilton Rowan, as I said. He was a member of the Grand Orient in France and actually had been installed into the Bavarian Illuminati by Weishaupt himself. Then we had Jackson. Jackson, he attended what was called the famous meeting at White's Hotel in Paris in November 1792 with Fitzgerald and Paine. He was sent to Ireland to whip up the trouble. Go ahead, get you over there, start talking to the masses. He had been found with these notes and the letters. He was sentenced to hang, and he actually poisoned himself in the dock. Speaking of the United Irishmen, the author of the Secret Societies in Ireland states, there were many of these in the United Irishmen. He's talking about Freemasons. And that some Masonic lodges were devoted themselves entirely to the revolution. That is what they had done in France. In 1796, the government spy, Henry Smith, said, the United Irishmen had been established within the Masonic order. There is scarcely an United Irishman who is not a Mason, nor a Mason who is not both. Brendan Clifford, who is no friend of Orangism, tells us in his writings and connections with Freemasons and the United Irishmen that Freemasonry was the yeast in the United Irishmen movement. In fact, he puts in another way, an crudely way. He says, alternatively, the United Irish movement was rotten to the core with Freemasons. No Orangemen here. So what is that? We see how that's all built up. What's the aftermath? What's the effect on that after 1798? What goes on? We have a rebellion. We have the Battle of the Diamond. We'll not go into it. We have time constraints tonight, so we can't go into those details. But we've seen where this influence has been coming from. How the Illuminati has twisted things, how they've controlled things. Things didn't really quieten down after the 1798 rebellion. The United Irishmen mightn't have been any longer officially in existence, but there were still battles taking place. Do you know who the battles were taking place between? The battles, believe it or not, were taking place between Freemasons and Orangemen. There are a number of incidents that continued on for maybe 20 years concerning Orangemen and Freemasons actually attacking one another. Mostly Masons attacking Orangemen, I may add. In Garva on the 24th of May, 1802, Masons attacked locals who they believed to be Orangemen. On the 7th of June, they entered the fair at Kilrea, not far from Garva, and ran up and down the main street, insulting the memory of King William and abusing anyone who they thought had Orange sympathies. A Belfast newsletter report of the time, believe it or not, says about 6 o'clock in the evening, after the greatest part of the people were supposed to have gone, a large mob, calling themselves Freemasons and headed by the master of Vow Lodge, assembled in a very tumultuous manner, armed with large sticks and quarter poles, calling out for Orangemen so they could attack them. I'll not read the whole thing, but the Orangemen were attacked and had to take refuge in a house. The Masons surrounded the house, and the Orangemen had guns in the house and opened fire, killing 2 of them. A week later, 2 Orangemen were acquitted of charges of murder in Downpatrick because they had defended themselves against another Masonic attack. In Londonderry, an attack by Masons and Orangemen resulted in 5 deaths. A report from County Tyrone in 1803 tells us that Masons were continually attacking those who they thought were Orangemen. In the first battle at Dromore, the Freemasons prevailed. The second at Finton, the Orangemen prevailed. In the towns and villages, Masons attacked Orangemen and those who they thought had Orange sympathies. See the continual going on here. If Masonry had anything whatsoever to do with Orangism, they wouldn't be attacking one another. Why? Why would Freemasons continually want to attack and even murder Orangemen at the time? Well, Brenton Clifford puts it this way. The Orange Order was formed in opposition to Freemasonry of the North, which was at the very heart of the United Irish movement. The founding principles of Orangism cannot embrace Masonry in any of its guises. Orangism holds to the Protestant Reformation and biblical principle. Masonry holds to Luciferian, Enlightened Illuminism. A report in the Northern Whig in 1925 tells us that this antagonism was still alive right the whole way through up until the 1840s, when Orange lodges put an oath to their members that they were not allowed to join Masons. The question has to be asked to us all, why does Orangism attract so much universal hatred? The media hate it. Worldwide political figures hate it. Religious groups hate it. Well, the answer is simple. Orangism stood against the greatest conspiracy ever brought against mankind. And do you know something? A small group of tenant farmers and nobodies who had nothing but their belief in the Reformation and a Bible stood against the wickedness of a one world government and the papacy. And they defeated it. But do you know something? Today, that conspiracy's back. It's back. Protestantism, against all odds, has held its own in this country. Against the twin evils of Illuminized Freemasonry and against ecumenism and Romanism. Bubba Wilson shook his fist at Freemasons in Benburb in 1791 when they watched Protestants being burned from their homes, and he was a Freemason. And because Freemasons wouldn't stop it, he shouted at them, "This day I lay a star that you never put out." And he did. Many times they have tried to destroy the biblical witness in Ulster, but God has intervened. Today we have the twin Trojan horses of ecumenism and Freemasonry once again trying to destroy Orangism and Protestantism in this land. We must expose them and cry once more like our forefathers, "This we will maintain." I'm going to leave you with a verse. I'm going to leave you with Galatians 5:1. "Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again with the yoke of bondage." Amen.